Good afternoon. I'm here with Dr. June Feiner. She's one of our residents here at Woodland Pond. And for years I've known that Dr. Feiner was involved with civil rights movements here in the United States, and I thought who better to talk about those experiences than Dr. Feiner herself. We're going to really talk a lot about Dr. Feiner's experiences here in America starting in 1960, and she'll let us know, how she got here. But just a reminder that if you're interested in understanding how Dr. Feiner grew up in England, she's got a chapter in the book, in our War Times Remembered book that was written by Woodland Pond residents years ago, maybe going on 8 or 9 years ago now.
Yeah, 7, 8 years ago.
So you can find that in our library. She's got a chapter there. So Dr. Feiner was just telling me when I asked, how did you make your way to the United States and then get involved with all of this amazing work? So why don't you take us from there, Dr. Feiner?
Okay. I came to the US mainly because I couldn't decide quite what to do. I had finished my training as a doctor in London, done my internship, and then was a little at loose ends. And I had this family of relatives in Chicago, so I thought, well, I'll go to the States and look around for a year or two, and then I'll go home again. And then when I got settled in the US, I took a job at Michael Reese Hospital as an intern, because someone advised me to do that, because having finished a US internship, I was then eligible to take the exam and get a US license. So that was my procedure. And then when I was an intern at Michael Reese, I met this guy, Quentin Young, who's well known in the whole activist movement, civil rights, particularly in Chicago, from way back. He was an old leftist, and they had this organization called the Committee to End Discrimination in Chicago Medical Institutions, which was old. By the time I was there in 1960, the organization had been active for many years. So through him, I began to get into the whole civil rights struggle. But it was interesting. I could see at Michael Reese Hospital as an intern and then as a resident that there were definitely two levels of care. That there was the private wing with single rooms where the white middle class people had their treatment, and then there was the service units, the wards, where you had 8 or 9 people in a room all together. And at the clinics, you could see that the patients got a little bit of short shrift. So I was beginning to see the inequalities, right at the beginning then. And because of my relationship with Quentin, I became politicized and realized that, things had to change.
Now, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
What was the payer source for those patients at that time? Was everything private pay?
I think there were some insurance plans for the wealthier patients. I think they did pay for insurance plans. And there was something equivalent to Medicaid. I don't know quite what it was. There was ADC, age-dependent children, and I think there was some other coverage. That the hospital, I think, had to take a certain number of these service patients as part of their charter. Those patients, I think, did not pay individually.
Okay, so there's definitely an economic component
Yes.
to this as well.
Oh, for sure. Yes, there was. So with this group CED, we did some educational work with school children from the black neighborhoods and took them on trips and showed them medicine and biology, and that was, a wonderful thing. And then as the whole civil rights struggle escalated, there was a big organization in Chicago to send a train to the Civil Rights March in 1963, the big march where Dr. King spoke. And I remember that very clearly. There was a trainload, a big, long trainload of people from Chicago who all went to Washington. And those of us in the medical people, we had a little bag and we sort of walked up and down the train and made sure that everybody was well and anybody had any medical problems. So that was sort of my first exposure to a large demonstration.
Right.
And it was really, really very exciting.
Now, the people on the train, were they primarily one race?
They were mostly black.
Mostly black?
Yeah. There were there was a fairly large community of white liberal supporters, white progressives in Chicago. So it was a mixed group, but I would say the majority were black. many of them unions. The unions, they all wore their union hats and things. There were quite a lot of people from the different service unions.
Yeah, and was it mostly, younger people? I mean,
No, they were all ages.
All ages.
It was that was a wonderful thing that there were people of all ages on that train. And
including
the spirit,
children?
Yes, there were some children. The spirit was wonderful. People were singing and sharing food, and the whole feeling on the train and at the march was a very positive thing. And I think people went home feeling hopeful. And then as things escalated in the South, a group of civil rights activists from the South decided to form an organization of several civil rights organizations, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the NAACP, and those three organizations mostly formed a group called COFO. And COFO supported and developed Freedom Summer. So 1964 was Freedom Summer. And the whole premise of Freedom Summer was that white middle-class students would go to the South and live there with families or in specially set up housing and help to support the Black movement and to work very hard on voter registration. And they set up these freedom schools. And the leader of that group, James Foreman, who's now died some years ago, James Foreman came to a group of doctors in New York and Chicago and said, we're gonna need some medical backup. So almost immediately an organization was formed called the Medical Committee for Human Rights. So that was like the spring of '64. And of course in Chicago, we already had this group CED, and it just basically became MCHR. So I was in the middle of that whole group. And and what the people in the North did, they would send teams of medical people to the southern parts where there was student activity for Freedom Summer, and we would stay for a few days, a few weeks, and we would help in whatever way we possibly could. So that was the first time I ever went south. I went to Mississippi in summer of 1964.
And how were you received?
In the Black community with open arms. I mean, we felt wonderful. We were welcomed, we were housed, we were fed, and the organization had a fair amount of money, so they'd done a lot of fundraising in the North. And so we had a rental cars. In teams of 2 or 3, we would drive around our area and talk to people, and we gave first aid classes. We went to any demonstration that was happening with our first aid kits. We would interview local doctors and find out their attitudes towards their Black patients. We would go to the local hospitals and check out the situation there, talk to the local Board of Health. So we did a whole variety of different things. And when things started getting more ugly with arrests, we would do prison visits to try and make sure that the civil rights workers had not been beaten up. We would demand an interview with them and talk to them. So there were a lot of things we did. That was just 2 weeks that summer. And then I came back north, and then in, I forget which month it was, in '65 was the Selma to Montgomery March. And so that was the next time that, and in the meantime, there were many, many demonstrations in Chicago. There was the Cicero Housing March and a lot of violence. So we were on the streets in Chicago for local demonstrations. But in '65, teams of us went to Selma to help out with the march. And that was, I don't know if you can even see it, but that was when this picture was taken. We set up a there was a big tent set up every night, and where the people slept, and we had a little corner in the tent, and we would see people. And most of the things that we had to see people about was their feet.
Yeah.
Because people were not used to walking for long distances.
Wow.
And they had inadequate footwear. So that was the Selma Montgomery March. And this was a famous photograph. This guy won a prize for this photo. Matt Herron was his name. This was one of the iconic images of the Selma to Montgomery March.
Wow.
So that was I think spring of '65. I don't remember exactly when it was. And then I volunteered. I had a part-time job at that time, not a part-time job, but a job that I could easily leave.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing a little research project. I'd finished my residency, and so I decided I would head south for some months. And I got a position with the MCHR. I was like the southern coordinator for MCHR, and I set up an office in Selma. We rented a house. And then when the groups of people came from the north to help out, I would meet them and we would house them in the house and train them, and then they would go out in teams to do whatever work was necessary at all the demonstrations that were happening in 1965. So I was there in Selma for probably a couple of months, and then I spent some time in well, before that, I was in Mississippi for a few weeks, I think, and then Selma for a couple of months, and then I set up an office in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge. We also had activities there. Same sort of work, attending at demonstrations, dealing with injuries on the spot, helping to train the civil rights workers so they themselves could do first aid and sort of first care, and doing our interviews with local doctors and local businesses and anything that we thought might be useful, or anything that the whole headquarters of the civil rights groups, wanted us to do. We saw ourselves as just as a wing, as a backup to the civil rights movement.
So obviously, I mean, I think about, one of the things I'm trying to do through this project is understand the motivation, right? So you became motivated through an individual that you met. But there must have been something in you that felt hope. And you mentioned before we started filming that there was hope at that time, or a feeling like change could happen.
Yeah, I mean, things were so bad. I guess everybody said that, it has to get better.